Welcome back, AP. All right, welcome to your first of two Thanksgiving break flips. And of course, you'll have an LEQ as well that will be sent later on in the week. Do not expect it any earlier than like Wednesday. I'm really trying to find a good one. I'm also remaking the entire rubric so you can have a little bit of an easier guide to kind of get along with, understand, move your way through so we can start nailing down that pesky analysis point, right? I've also started grading y'all's tests, looking very solid so far. Very, very impressed. So a lot of y'all have a lot to be proud about. So definitely watch these flips at your leisure. Get into them when you can. Don't worry about watching every single second of it like the moment break begins, because we do have a lot of big themes coming up in this one especially, okay? Now, really, really quick, okay? So the big themes we're getting into today, we're going to be talking about kind of like the industrious revolution, how the putting out system in the cottage industry and the agricultural industry and the agricultural revolution is going to kind of have like a snowball effect, right? And it's just going to kind of keep building and building and building and building and building, getting a lot bigger, right? So we've left off on how it was getting really, really big right before your test when we talked about how the agricultural revolution made farming much more efficient, which freed up a lot more people to have like time to work. They started doing the cottage industry, putting out system, make things in steps, sell it all at a price, make money, industrious revolution, go buy some stuff for your house. All right, so now that's a lot of really big important stuff, and we'll do like maybe a graphic organizer at some point so we can see how like one thing continued to lead to the other. But now getting on to continue going forward is not only do we have a lot more people milling around, not only do we have landless laborers trying to find work, which is turning them to these factories before factories in the putting out system, and they're starting to manufacture goods within their homes, particularly early on textiles, but eventually it would encompass almost all things. Things that were formerly made by hand are now going to be made in steps because it's going to be much more efficient, it's going to cost less, and you're going to see why here in a minute it's going to cost a lot less. But not only do we have more people available to work, there's also just now going to be more people available, right? So you're going to see a massive population explosion starting around the 1700s, right? So seeing right here from about 1550 and onward, we're seeing a huge surge forward in population, right? Now, really quick, looking at this graph right here, which will be on your next test, this exact one, just to give you a heads up, you can see that the population had a solid moving up right before this moment right here. And what that was the Black Death, right? So the Black Death hits landfall in Europe in 1347, and it kills literally almost 50% of Europe, as you can see. So for the next several hundred years, you're going to have things that limited population growth, or if any of you are math nerds out there, Salvaggio, Rolly, y'all can see actually that there was a proportionally even level of population growth, right? We can see this curve right here, see this curve right here, and they are almost proportionally in speed like very, very similar, right? So we are then, though, going to hit this moment, right? Right about here in the early 1600s, we're going to have a little bit of a dip, but then whoosh, and it's just going to shotgun right back up again, okay? Now, that dip, you know what that dip was, right? Right there. That dip, 30 Years' War, all right? So, like, the dip right here was the 30 Years' War, and then it's going to shotgun forward again, and right around 1700s, it's going to explode, okay? Now, mainly reasons why it wasn't growing before 1700s, you got the Black Death. Infant mortality is a big one as well. Check this out. Write this statistic down next to infant mortality. 70% of childbirths ended in either the death of the mother or the child. All right. So you had also, let me rephrase as well, 70% of them, those living children, most of them did not reach the age of 10. So you did have a heavy amount of infant mortality due to some like different diseases like typhus, scarlet fever, typhoid, like very minor things, ailments that we could actually these days actually really, really easily get rid of. This virus that causes the whooping cough was a very, very big one that could easily kill a child early on, right? Then you're also going to see war, right? We have this massive population dip right here from the 30 Years' War, and also the poverty caused by the price revolution, right? So right around this era right here, you're going to see another dip as well due to the fact that because the inflation flowing into Europe from Spanish gold and silver is going to devalue most of the currency in Europe, but especially in Spain, it's going to make people who were poor now even poorer because the money that they had was now devalued, right? But then right around the 1700s, don't let these pictures scare the daylights out of you. That is a cow udder right there, and that's a picture of smallpox. But right around 1700, it's going to fly up, right? The 1700s is going to see massive population growth. So now not only do you have more people moving into cities, more people doing the rural cottage industry, but you also just have larger families that their children are not dying in infancy and actually losing out on the population growth early on. So causes of this, finally, first of all, the plague is going to finally end. The last time the plague was seen in Europe in a decent size was right around early 1700 in the south of France in Marseille, right? So, but you're finally going to see that be eradicated because the Europeans had adopted several different practices up to this point for spreading out, quarantining, like actually burning the bodies and things like that, and actually moving forward. So they had methods, hygiene, better hygiene standards, and different methods to actually prevent the plague from spreading like crazy, right? Now, you're also going to see better medicine, right? Medicine and medicinal ideas are going to show up soon, mainly the cowpox vaccination, right? So big one right here, cowpox looks like this, okay? Cowpox is a disease that cows themselves would actually get, and they would show up on their udders and stuff and could sometimes kill the cow depending on the severity of the infection, right? Now, what a scientist that I can never remember what his name is. I got to look it up. There was a scientist from, I believe he's either from Holland or England, because of course Netherlands and Britain are leading the way on everything these days. Cowpox vaccine. All right, so his name was smallpox vaccine. Oh, yeah, he's a British doctor named Edward Jenner, right? And Edward Jenner is going to realize that his milkmaids are not getting or are not susceptible to smallpox, right? Smallpox is a very severe disease. And for some of you, I don't think you've ever seen what it actually looks like, but that is smallpox. This is chickenpox, right? Smallpox is a very deadly disease that, as we know, killed almost 80% of the Native Americans in large Native American communities in the New World when the Spanish came into contact with them. So smallpox has been a thing that Europeans have been dealing with for large portions of time. It was very, very easy to kill a child. And sometimes that people would have scarring on their faces and stuff from smallpox and multiple smallpox infections from throughout early parts of their lives. There's one famous person that I can never remember who had smallpox scars everywhere. I think it might have been Cromwell. I think Cromwell might have had some scars on his face from smallpox when he was a child. But the big thing is Edward Jenner realizes that his milkmaids never got smallpox and never actually were anywhere close to getting it. And he figured out it's because if you have cowpox in your system, which is a virus that does not affect humans whatsoever, then that virus kills the smallpox virus, right? So he realizes that by inoculating people with the cowpox virus in 1797, when it becomes widespread and it starts kind of getting around all over Europe, they literally had this little pronged fork that they would take and they would scoop up some like cowpox pus and then they would go, and then they would just stick you with it, right? So, and then you actually were now immune to smallpox because the cowpox virus would multiply in your body and work almost like antibodies and would kill the smallpox virus, right? So also you're going to see a lot of better things going forward. You're going to see absolutists make efforts to make water and sewage infrastructure a lot better. So we're not going to be living in our own sewage as much anymore, which is going to limit disease as well. Enclosures and drainage systems are going to limit the areas of standing water, which is going to limit breeding of insects, right? So you're going to see less mosquitoes popping up throughout all of Europe, which is going to help limit malaria and yellow fever as well. Also, infrastructure, roads, canals, and railways that are, well, not railways yet, but things that are going to be built by these absolutists are going to make it easier to move food from place to place to prevent things like ergot poisoning, which we will talk about a little bit later on, all right? So we'll actually talk about it in the French Revolution. Ergot poisoning, right next to this right here. Just put ergot poisoning was a really big problem, all right? It actually gave you, well, I don't want to spoil it, but it could kill you, but it actually made you feel a little loopy there as well. We'll talk about how that might have affected the French Revolution a little bit later on. And also, new foods from the New World are going to give you a more nutritious diet, which is going to lead to better population growth and healthier citizens, right? And the best example is the potato, right? Frederick the Great, the potato, everybody the potato. Potatoes rule all, right? Morgan Hutchinson, I know you're a big fan, right? But I had potatoes this morning. I had hash browns, actually. Now, so you're going to see massive population growth, which is huge, okay? Now, how is this going to affect already long-standing economic structures that have carried over from the Middle Ages? Well, it's going to hurt them, all right? So not hurt the economic growth, it's actually going to help the economic growth, but it's going to hurt old economic practice, right? So y'all remember guilds? Remember talking about guilds? If you don't remember what a guild is, it's really okay, all right? So guilds were these collectives, right? You had a collective group of guild members who would specialize in making certain things, right? So looking at this parade of guild members right here, you can actually see there were gun guild makers, there were printer guilds, there were not printer guilds actually, there were like paper guilds, there were carding guilds before the putting out system was really big, barrel making guilds. So what a guild was an organization of men, remember that, men, all right? So an organization of men that would collectively come together with several masters and then teach apprentices how to make certain crafts, right? So you would have guilds that would make smithing guilds that would make armor. You would have farriers guilds, which would make horseshoes, right? So these guilds set the prices of their product though, okay? The problem with guilds is that when you compare a guild to the putting out system, which is actually popping up, where like we make everything in steps, right? Where I give wool to the to Malaya's family and they card it out and straighten it, and then I gave it to Molly's family who strings it or spins it, and then I give it to Cassie Swallow's family who looms it together, and then I pay them for all of those steps. I take it and sell it for a huge profit, right? So that's cheaper. The putting out system is cheaper than making products in a guild, right? Because guilds do certain things that limit economic growth, right? So they set their own prices, right? Which is a very big thing. So you're basically forced to buy certain products from guilds depending on how much they want to charge for it, right? So you also have to understand that guilds are more comparably, like they care about making money for themselves. The merchant guilds, right? Remember we talked about guilds in the Renaissance. There's two types of guilds, merchant guilds and craft guilds. Well, merchant guilds were growing because they had to sell products from all the way over in East Asia, right? We talked about the Renaissance. Venetian merchant guilds were selling porcelain and tea and spices and all these goods coming from the Eastern kingdoms. Well, they could never sell goods coming out of European cities. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the guilds were prioritized with making money for themselves. So there was never really anything there for the merchant guilds to create. They also, you have to understand, is urban guilds pretty much created monopolies, right? Because you got to remember, this is the 1600s, 1700s Europe, where if you wanted a certain product, you had to go to your guild in your city to get that product. You couldn't just go and be like, well, you know, there's a guild down in Marseille that apparently sells these things for a little bit cheaper. You couldn't get there. You couldn't get there to actually buy these goods from guilds that may or may not sell them for cheaper because the infrastructure didn't exist, right? So, but then the absolutists are going to come along, and the absolutists are going to start realizing that guilds are also kind of expensive, right? So they restrict female workers. They restrict Jewish and religious, like non-religiously tolerated people. They don't let foreigners into their guilds. And they're very exclusive, right? So that's a problem, especially in post-absolutist Europe, right? Or post-mean absolutist Europe. And now we got enlightened absolutists, right? In enlightened absolutism Europe, people are going to start looking at these guilds being like, no, our country is throwing the doors open to the religious, like people who have been thrown out of their countries. Huguenots, you are welcome. Catholics from, I don't know, the Holy Roman Empire, you are welcome, right? Come into our borders. So the guilds really, really created a problem, right? Because they were actually stifling and forcing the economic growth of Europe to plateau. So what you're going to see is absolutists, especially enlightened absolutists under people like Louis XV, Frederick the Great, Catherine the Great, the Habsburgs, they're going to start dissolving guilds. And they're going to be like, look, you no longer have claim to a monopoly over this product, right? And so what's going to happen, especially in France as an example, by 1791, every guild was dissolved, right? Many believe that they slowed economies, technology, and political advancement. And it is a true thing. This right here is actually the Seal Guild of Card Makers, right? There was an actual guild in France that made playing cards, right? Like you're talking about now, playing cards can be made in the rural, like, townhomes and the houses out in the country because a merchant can bring them paper, right? They can make that paper into small subsets. They can take it to another house where they stamp everything, and then they collect them, assemble them, and then throw them out, and they sell it on their own. So this putting out system in this rural cottage industry is replacing those guilds, which is a very big thing. Now, what is this going to do also, though? The banishment of guilds is going to now give way to this thing known as economic liberalism, right? Economic liberalism is an idea pioneered by Adam Smith, right, in his Wealth of Nations, which looks down on the concept of mercantilism, right? So you have to understand, we're seeing the birth, jot this down, in the 1700s, you are seeing the birth of capitalism in Europe and the growth of mercantilism in the international trade, right? So capitalism, though, will eventually replace mercantilism. And who came up with capitalism? Your boy Adam Smith, right? Adam Smith is the first person to give a name to the economic process of capitalism. Did it exist already? Of course it did, right? Like capitalism has existed always, right? The idea that you're going to create a product, right? And you need to sell that product, so you are competing with other people who are selling that product. So let's look at economic liberalism for a hot second, right? So you can jot this down in your notes if you want, or you can just listen along. Guilds violate the concept of economic liberalism because they set their own prices and they create monopolies on goods, right? Adam Smith says economic liberalism and capitalism are better because of this concept known as the invisible hand, right? Jot down the invisible hand. This is very important. He believed that this concept known as the invisible hand regulates competition and provides economic growth, right? So look at it this way. Let's say I am a merchant and I use the Jones family, the Mangiapane family, the Swallow family to create my cloth, right? I use those three families. They create it in the putting out system in certain steps. They make my cloth. But I got Lisa Reams that lives like 2 towns over, who also has a set of families who make cloth and do their own thing. And she sells her cloth at a lower price than me. Ooh, what the heck, Miss Reams? You're really messing me up right now. So the invisible hand is going to force me to either do one of two things: increase the quality of my product so I can charge more for it, or possibly reduce the quality and lower my price. Maybe I'll fire the Malia Jones's family and I'll give one of that family's jobs to Molly's as well, so I can reduce the cost that is necessary to make my product to limit my price so I can keep my profits, right? So the invisible hand of competition states that free trade, and the wealth of nations states that free trade and competition benefit all people, wealthy and poor, right? Well, it didn't really benefit Malia's family, but Malia's going to easily get employed during this system by somebody else. The Reams family may employ them because they live only 2 towns over, and the infrastructure provided by these absolutists make it so they can actually quickly get over there and actually still supply them with product to make. Man, my hair looks goofy. Now, look, but the big thing, though, also, is you have to understand is that according to Smith, trade has to remain free, especially trade in continental Europe, right? So as we are seeing capitalism blossom in Europe and mercantilism still existing in international trade, you have to understand is he is advocating for the fact that he says no government should interfere with the growth of capital gains, right? Government, stay out, mind your own business. And that literally means laissez-faire. Laissez-faire is defined by no government intervention in economics, right? You are allowed to tax, but you should not be heavily regulating anything, right? And you should not be regulating things in a mercantile perspective. Because when we looked at mercantilism, right? Mercantilism was Louis XIV, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, grow as much gold as possible because they believed that the amount of money available in the world economy was finite and that there was only so much available, so we need to get as much as possible, right? Well, Adam Smith is showing you that that's not necessarily true, especially not in local economics, right? Because you should be like focused on, fine, your colonies, you want to worry about that, that's fine. But do not regulate or limit economic growth in the continent itself, because if everyone else is making money, then you get to tax them heavier, right? Like so, or your tax revenues will go up. And you can use those taxes to provide defense, to sponsor public works, to serve judicially, and to basically start like going against this whole mercantile idea. Now, don't write this. Don't write this. But I think this is very important to just throw out there, okay? Adam Smith would be disgusted with the modern era of capitalism, right? Because he did think that certain things needed to happen. And from a bad reading of capitalism and from a bad reading of the wealth of nations, sometimes people have actually thought that like, oh, Adam Smith supports this idea of never taxing anybody or whatever. No, laissez-faire doesn't mean the government's not supposed to tax you. They're still going to do that. He's saying that by you minding your own business, government, and paying attention to that over there and worry about your colonies, which is something you can control, allow the government and allow the economics in continental Europe to grow, then you'll just make more money in taxes because everyone's making more money. It benefits the rich and the poor, right? So Adam Smith, though, would not like modern-day capitalism because he supported wage increase, right? He said over time, workers need to be paid more, right? That, like, wages need to increase. He also hates the division of labor, right? So, like, he doesn't like the putting out system, ironically enough, and the putting out system later on would actually lead to what you would know as the division of labor between certain areas of factory work and things like that. Also, don't write this, but he quoted himself saying that no society can surely be flourishing and happy of which a far greater part of the members are poor and miserable, right? So I know some of y'all, Angelina, I know you're like, just like, yep. And like, so, but like, you got to do what you got to do, all right? So now look, so just so we know that And now that guilds are dying and economics are becoming more free-flowing, we just now need to start. Well, that was talking about the local European economy, the continental economy. But what about the global economy? Don't look at this yet. We're getting there, okay? Well, what about the global economy? Where does Adam Smith go into the global economy? Where does he fit in that? Well, Adam Smith said that the two most important discoveries of mankind was the discovery of the Americas and the discovery of the Cape of Good Hope, right? Now, interestingly enough, he did not believe that his capital system could be immediately applied to international and trade-based economics due to the fact that it's just a little bit different. You've got governments that own these colonies, right? You have these other different products. However, you can see Adam Smith's ideas beginning to infiltrate the mercantile trade economies. Who were the people that traded all those goods? Yes, Emma Dewey. Yes, the East India Companies, right? The East India Companies represent Adam Smith's capital ideas, right? Because the Dutch would go to the colonies that were even American colonies that were owned by the British at the time and be like, well, I can sell you cheaper tea and also ship your goods back home for free. Cheers, right? So you saw capitalism beginning to eke its way into the international trade economy, right? But it was small and it was fledgling early on, right? Now, Spain and Portugal, what about those guys? Remember them? Remember Spain and Portugal, like way back in the day? Yeah. Well, in the 1700s, none were as dominant as these three guys, okay? Spain and Portugal kind of, and they just kind of began to evaporate, right? Portugal was the original spice traders in India, but they got ousted by the British East India Company, they got ousted by the French East India Company, and they got ousted by the Dutch East India Company, right? So the Portuguese are pretty irrelevant at this point, okay? And I mean that full-heartedly. Irrelevant, all right? So then also, Spain was still in the Americas, right? They were still making some money. Their silver mining was beginning to stabilize, which we'll talk about here in a minute. They were staying alive, right? But they were never nearly as powerful following the massive inflation that occurred in their country following under the rule of Philip II. When the Netherlands broke away from them, they lost an expansive amount of money, and the Spanish Armada lost them an expansive amount of money, right? So they're pretty irrelevant. So in the 1700s, which is the century that we're in now, no one is now as dominant as Great Britain because as of 1707, under Queen Anne, the person who knighted Isaac Newton, he is Sir Isaac Newton because Queen Anne knighted Sir Isaac Newton, saying his contributions to the British scientific community were like that worthy that of valor, right? She created this thing known as the Permanent Union, right? Where she binded together Scotland and England, and it was now known as Great Britain. Because Queen Anne, jot this down, is the last Stuart monarch, right? She's the very, very last Stuart monarch. Because remember, it went James, Charles, William, and Mary, and then there's going to be William the Fourth, which is Queen Anne's son, but he dies at like 15, so Queen Anne takes over as the female monarch, and none of her children survived into adulthood, so she was the last Stuart monarch, right? And also her husband died, really, really early on. She was a very, very sad story. She wasn't that bright, she wasn't very smart, and she had really huge problems with her legs, bone issues, joint issues with her legs. They had to be bound and wrapped all the time. She'd fly off the handle at parties and stuff like that because she was so much pain constantly. She kind of hid, and she only ever talked to these one of two women, which were they argued. One was the Duchess of Marlborough and everything like that. But that's not the point. Now the Netherlands is going to be very, very powerful in the mercantile trade economy, as we already know. And a lot of that is just due to their East India companies. Also, they had a West Indies company too. If you ever hear me reference anything called the West Indies Company, it means that it trades with the Western Hemisphere, right? So you're talking about North and South America. The East India companies, they trade with the sub-Indian continent, Indian subcontinent areas, right? Then you had France, right? So you had three big powerhouses. Well, out of those three, who do we think is going to rise up to become the most dominant, ridiculous, and strong trade power that the world's ever seen? And it's going to be Britain, right? So Great Britain is going to ascend. And they are going to ascend fast, and they are going to ascend big, and basically from just sheer luck and inconclusive wars, they're going to become the dominant trade power throughout all of Europe, right? Now, not to say, really quick, Subnote, disclaimer, not to say that the other ones are completely irrelevant. France will hold on a little bit, but they'll never be as strong as the British were. The Dutch do hold on, but remember, like we said, their golden age went up and they kind of plateaued and didn't really keep going forward necessarily. But the reason why Great Britain is going to grow so powerful is because there are problems with mercantilism, right? The problem with mercantilism is a lot like what Adam Smith was saying, is that you're shipping through country-regulated industries, right? So you've got issues with Britain's going to say you can't like ship on certain boats or blah, 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 blah. Or like you're going to basically have this big issue where boats are for specific countries and not companies anymore, because at one point during the 1700s, the British are going to buy the East India Company and it basically becomes their mercantile navy, right? So, and then also they're making so much money, right? So shipping through a country perspective and all of this money, and then you add to that really insanely intense absolutist and intense government patterns in Europe at this point, which is going to equal what? War, right? So like the big problem with mercantilism up to this point is that it didn't have enough of Adam Smith's capitalism. Adam Smith's capitalism would have said that it shouldn't be the Dutch East India Company. It should belong to the joint stockholders of that group. They make the money, and the British or the Dutch, the way you get your money is you just tax them. But keep your nose out of it, right? Well, everything started going sideways with who? Cromwell. Boo! Nobody likes Cromwell. That's why they cut his head off and put it on a stick. All right, so like big thing about it, though, the Navigation Acts are going to set many of these wars in motion, due to the fact that it sets a precedent of mercantile acts, right? It sets a precedent of, screw laissez-faire, I'm just going to get super involved, right? Well, the Navigation Acts created a shipping monopoly on goods going to and coming from the 13 colonies, right? So basically with the Navigation Acts, Oliver Cromwell said that no good that is going to or from the colonies can be shipped on anything but British vessels, right? That is going to lead to several very large wars known as the Anglo-Dutch Wars that were happening underneath Cromwell and also underneath Charles II, right? Remember when we talked about Charles II being cousins with Louis, and Louis was like, I'll help you in the Third Anglo-Dutch War as long as you promise to publicly convert to Catholicism, take this stupid little allowance, and ease the restrictions on Catholics in your country? Well, yeah, that's all tied to the Anglo-Dutch Wars that were going on at the time. They were massive trade and naval wars. They very rarely broke out on land. And that's going to be like encouraging the building of warships, which becomes a very massive, important structure. But just so you know, the Anglo-Dutch Wars were from 1651 to 1674. And that kind of brought the plateau to the Dutch Golden Age, right? Because they were focused so much now on war with their vessels. They were losing trade internationally because of this and things like that. And also, it could easily be seen in the state of New York, right? So the state of New York serves as a great example of how the Dutch are going to hit their peak and then kind of plateau off, right? They're still very relevant. They're still very wealthy, and they still kept making a lot of money, as can be seen in their modern economics and modern culture. However, they're not nearly as like they're like kind of like that population chart we looked at. It just went and plateaued, right? They just kind of got up there and stayed up there, right? Which, hey, look, you're gonna do that, might as well just do that. There are also size limitations. They don't have a huge population, but the state of New York is a great example of how the Dutch kind of met their, not their end or their demise. They never had like a Spain moment, but how they kind of hit that plateau, right? Because the state of New York was originally a colony known as New Amsterdam, right? And so the city of New York was originally known as New Amsterdam, right? Named after the Dutch city of Amsterdam, because the Duke of, not the Duke of York, but the Duke of Amsterdam and the Prince of Orange founded that colony originally, and because of the Anglo-Dutch Wars, it was taken by the English, and then the Duke of York named it New Amsterdam, or not, crap, New York, right? New York as the Duke of York, right? So now, really big thing though, France, who does that leave now? So Spain and Portugal are irrelevant, right? We had three big powers. We had Britain, France, and the Dutch. So now that the Dutch are gone, we got two huge rivals. And those rivals are going to go to war, and it's going to play out like boxing matches, right? Huge wars are going to break out from 1701 to 17... Ew, no! Like that's not even the right year. So it's going to be from 1701 to end of 7 Years' War. All right, let's fix that. To 1763. So for 62 straight years, these two countries, these two trade powerhouses, These two dominant institutions in Europe, France and Great Britain, are going to square off in these very stereotypical images like and tip top, and they're just going to go right at each other. I will never get over hearing Salvaggi going, oh, pip pip cheerio. I will take that category, please. Now, round one was the War of Spanish Succession, which, as we know, started in like the early 1700s when Louis was an older man and he tried to claim the Spanish possessions when his grandson Philip V was about to ascend the throne because the Habsburgs died out in Spain. Now, as we know, though, Louis is going to lose. So France kind of loses that war, right? Now, the big second round war, okay, as we know, is going to all come down to the War of Austrian Succession. Now, we talked about that briefly when we were talking about Frederick the Great. So, Maria Theresa ascends the throne in Austria as the queen consort and queen of Austria and ruler of Austrian Habsburg lands, right? Frederick the Great in Prussia saw this as an opportunity due to the secession crisis to attack a place called Silesia, right? So he goes in after Silesia and he takes that over. That war grew into almost a worldwide war, right? There was war going on in Europe. There were conflicts breaking out in North America. There were conflicts breaking out in India and areas of Africa. So you could technically argue that this string of war is going to go on for quite some time. Now, to give you a heads up, the War of Austrian Succession started in 1740, all right? 1740. Now, the war was basically a draw. So Frederick the Great goes into Silesia, and he even continues to attack Austria. And you gotta give Maria Theresa credit. She may have lost one province, Silesia, right? She lost this province of Silesia, and like Prussia was able to kind of cement itself as like a new dominant military power. But look at Maria Theresa. This woman would go on to have 16 children, be a complete, like, awesome BA of a woman, and then also, not to mention the fact that she married some guy where she was like, fine, you can be the Holy Roman Emperor, but nobody cares about that title anyway. I'm going to keep control of Austria, right? So Maria Theresa, like, defended her lands from Russian invasion, Prussian invasion, and then, like, the French are going to ally with her, and then she's like, I don't really know if I like you guys that much. And, like, so all this other stuff, she played other countries against each other. Maria Theresa. Atta girl. She's up there with Catherine, right? She is a very, very powerful woman in all of European history. Now, big thing, though, round 3, which is going to be the biggest round out of all of them, is going to be this thing known as the 7 Years' War. Ha! Like, as we're looking at it right here, barely 7 Years' War, because many historians argue the fact that if you really want to get into this, that technically this war started somewhere in the 1540s, or not the 1540s, the 1740s, because when you look at it called the French and Indian War, you're going to see things get crazy, all right? So this war was absolutely wild, and it was inconclusive in Europe, okay? Very inconclusive, because due to the fact that it was an absolute all-out smackdown brawl, right? Now, there are 2 spheres of this war. You've got the 7 Years' War, which was the fighting going on in Europe, and you've got the French and Indian War, which is the fighting going on in North America, right? Now, in North America, the fighting is going to break out over French and British colonies, right? And the big thing about the French and Indian War is it is going to be a big lead to France's downfall in this. The British played this very, very well, okay? And big reason why they played it so smartly, a lot of it has to do with limited population, right? There wasn't even that many people of the French inside of North America. The French forces only had 55,000 people in North America versus the British colonies had 1.2 million, right? So what are the French going to do? They're going to ally with several Native American tribes, right? They ally with a bunch of Native American tribes to try and increase their forces, right? And so the French and Indian War ends up being a huge, huge brawl. But in Europe, this is the European theater. It was France, Russia, Austria, Saxony, Sweden, and the Native Americans. Well, they weren't over there. But then versus Britain, Prussia, and Hanover, right? So, and Britain allied with the Six Nations Iroquois and also the Cherokee as well. But that's going to be not as big of a deal as you would think, all right? So, but what ends up happening is this war ends up killing so many people and ends up being such a massive debacle and ends up being so insane that in 1763, everybody again basically is like, okay, it's a draw in Europe. No borders were changed in Europe. Nothing happened but expansive amounts of death in Europe, right? But what did happen is all the French losses in North America, right? So in North America, the French lost everything, right? So the 7 Years' War may have been a massive debacle of absolute clash that was going on, but no one really won and nothing really happened in the long run. And I'm going to attach a video down below that kind of explains the whole thing to you. Fighting broke out in India because French colonies there and English colonies there went to war, and then fighting was going on in Europe, fighting went on in North Africa, fighting went on in South America between Spain and Portugal at that moment, and then you're going to see all this other crazy stuff happening, and it was a worldwide war. This was a world war before world wars were cool, all right? So because back World War I wasn't even World War I. World War I was like World War III, II, whatever, because world wars have been going on for quite a minute already, okay? Now, in 1763, though, the Treaty of Paris, the first Treaty of Paris, is going to bring the 7 Years' War and the French and Indian War to an end, right? None of the country's borders in England or in Europe changed. But it was just a big, absolutist, I have a bigger army than you. The biggest thing that you could say out of Europe is Prussia cemented itself as a huge power in Europe, okay? It is so confusing to talk about because Russia ends up withdrawing when Peter III comes up, and that's Catherine the Great's husband, right? And so, and he's the one that ended that war, blah, 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 blah. But all you need to know is the 7 Years' War was inconclusive in Europe, right? Now, but in 1763, the Treaty of Paris does strip all land in North America and all of their stuff in India from the French. So this is a massive British victory. They're making huge amounts of money now. Huge amounts of money now, okay? And a lot of it is due to the fact, there we go. It's a massive British naval victory, all right? Because their huge navy and their huge land raids, because they're an island nation, so of course their navy's going to be massive, ends up leading to massive victories in North America. France is going to be left with one significant cash cow. One in North America. One. And it's the colony of Saint-Domingue. It's half of the island of Hispaniola. You know it is modern-day Haiti, right? So, because they were shipping out 90% of the world's sugar from there, okay? So, that's a big thing, though. Please keep that in mind. Jot down a little star, okay? France was left with one colony in North America, the island of Haiti, or Saint-Domingue is what it's called, right? That was the first true worldwide war, and it broke out in India, Africa, North America, the Caribbean, South America. Now, interestingly enough, also, you can see the significance of it in this painting. This is the death of James Wolfe, actually at the Battle of Quebec, which is a very massive turning point. And this is actually, as you can see, that right there is an Algonquin Native American who actually sided with the British in this victory, right? So, now, really interestingly enough, though, what was all this over? What was all this over? It was over trade goods more than anything else, right? The European theater was over small bits of land, large, military powerhouses using militaries they had been building up for all this time. You could honestly argue that the war in Europe had much more to do with absolute military growth, right? Than it had to do with anything else. But the wars going on in the oceans, right? Between military boats and between naval fleets was really over trade goods, right? You had goods like cotton now being made in India. The British saw a chance to now actually find cheap cotton textile material so they could put it into their putting out system back in England and actually make cheaper goods, right? You saw West Africans making this stuff called guar gum, which was a very, very big thing in the processing of certain new products that were showing up, industrial goods and things like that. So you had these large amounts of things being made. And all of this economic shifting in Europe and European dominance is not brought to you by reading Rainbow and Arthur. It's brought to you by trade and making all that money. And we're going to stop this flip there, and we're going to pick back up on this on the next one. I'll see you guys tomorrow, because I'm going to record that one tomorrow. Y'all have a good one.